I got a feeling that tonight's gonna be a good night. That tonight's gonna be a good night. That tonight's
Today, I will be presenting the article written by Nagy et al. In 2003 called Second Language Acquisition and Real French, an investigation of subject doubling in the French of Montreal Anglophones.
So what's the topic?
The topic of this article was subject doubling in French among the first generation of Montreal Anglophones who had access to French immersion schooling. For example, when people say things like, "Ma copine, elle venait me voir des fois." In this example, ma copine and elle are an example of a doubled subject.
Why is this topic important?
Research on this topic is important because people are interested to know, why do L2 speakers of French generally not subject double? Is it to maintain their Anglophone identity? Is it a partial mastery of L1 grammar, a sort of interlanguage status as mentioned by the authors of the article? Is it due to transfer from the English language? Additionally, findings from this article have very important pedagogical implications, which I will get to later on in my presentation.
What is the goal of this study?
The goal of this study was to determine the extent to which Anglophones acquired the variable grammar of their Francophone peers, and how it was related to the type of French instruction received and to the types of exposure to French.
So what about the research questions and the hypotheses?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because the 3 research questions posed by the authors were actually quite interesting. Number 1, does double subject marking, an L1 pattern not formally taught in school, exist in L2 French? Number 2, does the rate of double marking correlate with the type and amount of acquisition and contact with the Francophone community? Number 3, could L2 grammar be described by the same linguistic constraints as L1 French? The hypotheses in this study were, Anglophones who learned French primarily in school were not expected to subject double, whereas Anglophones who frequently spent time with Montreal Francophones were expected to subject double.
Tell me more. Who participated in this study?
Okay. So the participants of this study were 29 L2 French speakers, and they represented the first generation of Montreal Anglophones who had access to French immersion schooling in Montreal.
So what was the procedure again?
The researchers telephoned the participants to ask if they would be willing to do an interview about bilingualism in Montreal. The initial request for participation was done in English, and then they were asked if they'd be willing to do an interview in French by a Francophone researcher. All participants were interviewed in French and then in English a few weeks later. Interviews were tape recorded, lasted an hour, and discussed topics such as family background, use of French in the workplace, attitudes towards French politics, people, culture, and finally, incidents where language differences played a role. The interviews provided data about the participants' background and how they spoke in both French and English. The data collected in this study was analyzed using Goldvarb 2.0. Multivariate analyses determined the degree of correlation of several linguistic and social factors related to the type and quantity of exposure to French, to the presence of a doubled subject. The L2 data was then compared with data from L1 French. The data from Goldvarb revealed how likely doubling would be if there were a specific linguistic or social attribute.
So what are the results?
So the main findings were that L2 speakers who had more contact with native L1 speakers of French were more likely to double subjects, especially as adults. That is, subject doubling is associated with informal and colloquial speech. Another finding is that L2 speakers shared the grammar of L1 speakers to a great extent. The following results can be seen in Table 8. In terms of linguistic factors, L2 and L1 speakers favored subject doubling with ce and ça rather than a personal pronoun. L2 speakers were more likely to double the subject pronouns and more likely to double proper pronouns versus common nouns. Adverbs favor subject doubling. In terms of semantic factors, specificity and definiteness both favor subject doubling, whereas indefinite and non-specific subjects disfavored doubling. Go ahead, just say it.
Other findings worth discussing. The preverbal negator ne correlates with a decrease in subject doubling. Also, L2 speakers doubled their subject more often in main clauses than in subordinate clauses.
The discussion at the end of this study leads us back to a few interesting questions. Do L2 speakers of French want to sound native-like, or do they wish to keep their Anglophone identity? That is the question. And the answers to these questions are still difficult to figure out. The authors discussed conducting another study on L2 speakers who identify strongly with the Francophone culture, and they made reference to 2 participants named Liz and Ted, who both had high overall doubling rates to really test this hypothesis. The authors also mentioned that lower doubling rates exhibited by less integrated speakers could be due to structural explanations within the sentences. In conclusion, all L2 speakers had acquired the L1 pattern of subject doubling to some extent, even though it is not explicitly taught in the classroom. This shows that it is a pattern acquired through interaction with L1 speakers.
So what are the implications for teaching, learning, and language use?
So language teaching in schools is more effective with authentic interaction and exposure to colloquial speech, which means informal and naturally occurring Quebec French. This will really help the students become more integrated into the Francophone community and culture outside of the school environment. L2 French teachers should expose students to variations of French speech by using different types of media such as audio tapes, podcasts, or video recordings. This will allow students to broaden their knowledge of French and will set them up for success during real-life interactions with Francophones in their community. L2 French instruction should focus on authentic input and less on grammatical rules and textbooks if the goal is to get the students ready for French oral interactions. After reading this study, I found far more strengths than weaknesses. The strengths of the study were, it was easy to read and follow. The terminology was not too complicated, and the charts, tables, and graphs were well designed. The subject was interesting. Well, that's my opinion at least. The findings were relevant to teachers as well as students and will contribute to enhancing pedagogical practices. These findings will help to redesign classrooms, activities, and will promote more engaging ways of teaching French to L2 students. In my opinion, the biggest weakness of this study was placing the examples of linguistic and social factors, as well as the charts, tables, and graphs in the middle of the study. I would have preferred for these items to have been put in an appendix, because I found it became difficult to retain and digest all the information. However, this may just be a personal preference.
Thank you for listening to my presentation. Bloopers!
The first one was, does double subject marking, an L1 pattern not typically found in formal school? Oops. The initial request for willing to do an interview in French by a French would be willing to do and they represented the first generation of Montreal Anglophones. Oops, Francophones. Nope. Okay, never mind. So some other findings worth discussing. The preverbal negator. Okay, that sounded weird. Oh. Number 1, Anglophones who spent time in. Is it? Oh, wait, there was more than one hypothesis. My presentation. Is it a partial mastery of L1 grammar? It's generally not. Do you want to tell me the results, Colby? Okay. Well. Think about subject doubling in French.